Hi there everyone, I wanted to put together a video of my Google Earth tour showing Sir Edmund Hillary's ascent of Mount Everest, and this was to commemorate the 60th anniversary of that event, and this was part of me handing in for the mapping with Google certificate. And so I'm just going to click through my tour and give a little bit of commentary, but the videos and the audio clips tell the story. So the tour starts at Everest Base Camp, and we'll follow Hillary as he climbs up with the expedition to the top. So the 1953 British Mount Everest expedition arrived at base camp on the 12th of April 1953. This essentially was their best chance to summit Mount Everest, as a Swiss expedition had barely failed in the year before, and the Nepalese government had given rights to a French expedition for 1954. Therefore, there was plenty of pressure on the expedition to be successful, and fortunately for them, it was. There were 15, excluding Sherpas, on the expedition, including a cameraman and 2 doctors. There were 11 British, 2 New Zealanders, and 2 Nepalese, although Tenzing Norgay lived much of his life in India. The expedition leader was John Hunt, who was a British Army colonel, and the others had a range of professions, from physicist to statistician to director of a travel agency to schoolmaster, and famously an apiarist. This is the story of that famous beekeeper, Sir Edmund Hillary, and his ascent of Mount Everest. This video, Sir Edmund Hillary talks about how he came to climb Mount Everest.
I never had a vision to climb Mount Everest, as with everything else. It just more or less grew. You know, I started in the New Zealand Alps, and I got more competent, and I climbed harder mountains there, and I made a number of first ascents. And I had a year in the European Alps and climbed there. And then we decided we'd like to go off to the Himalayas, not Everest. We went off to the Indian Goal Himalaya, and we were pretty successful. We climbed half a dozen new peaks of well over 20,000 feet. And it really wasn't until then that we read in the paper that the British had got permission to do a reconnaissance to the south side of Mount Everest through Nepal, which up until those days had been completely closed to foreigners. That the idea that, gee, it'd be fun to go along on that reconnaissance certainly entered my mind. And we contacted the organisers in London, and 2 of us were invited from that expedition to join up with the party and go into the south side of Mount Everest. And, you know, it's almost like a football team, even a team of climbers. If you're pretty competent, and if you don't make any grave errors, once you're in, you're in. I mean, you're sort of appointed next time. So on the Everest reconnaissance, we had a successful expedition. We came back next year, and we had some more successful climbs. And then in '53, we were invited to join the summit attempt. So in a way, it was a growing process and a learning process. And never in my early days did I ever think of attempting to reach the summit of Mount Everest.
So just under the video, there's a list of people who were part of the expedition. And the next part is a diary page of Sir Edmund Hillary's diary, showing the elevation of some of the important landmarks and camps up to the summit. So now we'll go up the mountain, and we'll follow him up with readings from his diary.
May 10th, 2 to 4 to 2. A smashing morning. 4 Sahibs and 18 Sherpas left at 7:45. Took numerous photos. Trail breaking easy. Everyone feeling first class. Put in lots of flags. Soon became very hot indeed, and last hour was dreadful grind. Arrived at 4 by 11. Had some work on primuses and left at 12:10. Arrived at 3 at 1:10. John stayed at 4 with 4 Sherpas for 4 to 5 carry. Mike also stayed with him. I don't think he is going at all well. George in excellent form. Continued on to 5, 2 hours with 4 Sherpas. Had good reception with George on radio from 5, but nothing from 2 or base. Commenced snowing heavily at 2 p.m. and still going strong at 6:30 p.m. John reports very heavy snow at 4. Looks like a terrible grind tomorrow up to 4. May 11th and 12th, 3 to 4 to 3. Quite a plod with laden Sherpas. George and Angni Ma moved to camp from 5 to 6. Arrived back at 3 in very heavy snowstorm to find Griff Pugh arrived. Had a foot or more of snow in a couple of hours, 11th. Mike Westmacott is unable to get far above 5. May 13th, 3 to 4 to 3. A very tough day. Plugged up Coombe and up to 18 inches of snow. Took 4.5 hours up to 4. Returned in further snow. A really tough day. Less snow up head of Coombe, and George did reconnaissance above 6 to 7. Greg, Charles, Tom arrived up to 3. John hastening 4 to 5. Sherpas packing 5 to 6. May 14th. Sherpas had rest day. Tom B and Charles Evans, Wilf Noyce and I came up Coombe to Camp 4 and stayed. Discussed plans with John. George worked en route below Camp 6. May 15th, 4 to 7 to 5. Wilf Noyce and I left 4 and went to 5, where Mike Westmacott lying in bad condition. Sent him down. We took 3 laden Sherpas, Dao Tenzing, Ang Namgal and Pasang Puta, and went on up to Camp 6 to greet George Lowe and Ang Nima, who were having a rest day. I went on up to Camp 7 with 3 Sherpas and established Camp 7 with a tent, cooker and food. Returned down to Camp 5 and spent night there with Charles Evans. Both took a green sleeping pill. 5 to 6, 150. 6 to 7, 150. Heavy trail breaking. May 16th. Awoke with shocking headache as a result of pills. Charles the same. Descended to Camp 4. George Lowe and Wilf Noyce started from 6 for 7, but after halfway returned. George had taken sleeping pills with disastrous effect. Mike Ward and Charles at 5. May 17th. Self at 4. Party of Sherpas led by Charles Evans and Mike Ward set off from 5. Charles was ill and returned. Remainder continued on up to 6, where changed loads. Wilf and George had gone on up to 7 and did a short reconnaissance above. Sherpas packed loads up to 7. Wilf then returned with Sherpas and Mike Ward stayed with George and Dao Tenzing. May 18th. Self at 4. George, Mike and Dao Tenzing went for a short distance above 7 and then returned to camp. Apparently windy and cold, but it seemed to us at 4 that there was a certain lack of drive. Tom B took up a lift of Sherpas to Camp 7 and seemed to be going well. May 19th. self at 4. We watched Camp 7 with great eagerness, but no sign of activity. A strong wind blowing, but this eased about 11 a.m. John very depressed at lack of progress. George Band took lift of Sherpas to 7 and returned reporting George Low as indicating it was too windy and cold to start. May 20th. Attack starts. Self at 4. Wilf Noyce with 9 Sherpas went from 5 to 7 with loads for the South Col. George, Mike and Dar Tenzing only made a short sortie above 7 and then returned to Camp 4, not having got anywhere near the traverse. Charles Wiley went to Camp 5 with another 9 Sherpas laden with South Col loads. May 21st, 4 to 7. We watched eagerly from 4, but to our disappointment only 2 figures started from Camp 7. Wilf Noyce and Analu on oxygen climbed up the Lhotse Glacier, crossed the traverse and reached the South Col after some 4.5 hours going. A fine effort. 2.5 hours on the return. Wilf fixed a nylon line on the slopes leading down to the South Col. Charles Wiley and his team went up to Camp 7, thus all the Sherpas were together. We had discussed the unfortunate likelihood of no one going on the next day, and finally decided that Tenzing and I should scream up as a booster party to make sure that the Sherpas got to the South Col. We left at 12:15 on oxygen and arrived at 7 at 4:30. Tenzing was invaluable, and he and Charles organised all the loads in the evening, ready for an early start. With 17 people in camp, cooking facilities were inadequate and food and water insufficient. May 22, 7 to South Col and 4. Cooking started 5 a.m, but only a cup of tea was produced by the time we departed at 8:30 a.m. Tenzing and I were on oxygen, as was Charles Wiley. Tenzing and I led kicking and cutting steps. Made height quite well to top of Lhotse Glacier, but Sherpas were already pretty tired. The traverse took a lot of work preparing the route, and the Sherpas became slower and slower. Some were lying down and obviously all very tired. 2 who were in some distress, Tenzing and I each took an LA cylinder, 11 pounds off their 30-pound loads. We continued making the trail and finally breasted the Lhotse Ridge. Meanwhile, one of the Sherpas had given up and they had taken on his load, Charles Wiley taking a 20-pound cylinder of O2. We descended to the desolate windswept South Col and dumped our loads beside the wrecks of the Swiss tents. What a place! The South Summit looks absolutely terrific from here. 3 of the hardiest Sherpas, led by Dawa Tondup, arrived and got rid of their loads, and we all returned up the slope. Tenzing and I left our excess oxygen on the Col. We passed rest of Sherpas on the way to the Col, and Charles Wiley with solid load. We then plugged down across traverse, picking up exhausted Sherpa on way. Ground down to Camp 7 and had brief rest and drink. Then rest of us continued on down to Camp 4, a tremendous and successful day. We had put 13 loads of approximately 30 pounds on the South Col. At Camp 5, we passed John Hunt, Tom B., Charles Evans, Da Nam Gyal, and Balu on their way for the first attempt of the summit. May 23, self at 4. John, Tom and Charles plus Sherpas climbed to 7. May 24, self at 4. John and party left 7 and went very slowly indeed to South Col. Conditions were very bad and it took them 7 hours for the trip. We realised that their arduous trip would make an attack the next day impracticable. George Low, Greg and 8 Sherpas went off to 5 with South Col loads. May 25. 6 Sherpas with loads for Camp 7 departed early. Tenzing and I on oxygen left at 9:15 and reached Camp 7 at 12:30, 3.25 hours going. George and Greg with 8 Sherpas went from 5 to 7. A beautiful afternoon at 7 for a change, and I made up oxygen all afternoon and made up loads. May 26. George, Greg, Tenzing and I, plus 8 Sherpas, 5 to South Col and 3 Ridgemen, Ang Nima, Pemba and Ang Pemba, set off for South Col. I led all way and Tenzing and I went pretty quickly. Things were going all right, so I went on ahead. At 9:39, saw our first view of 2 ropes of 2 on ridge above the Kulwar. John away at 7 a.m. with Da Nam Gyal, John on 4 litres and Da Nam Gyal on 4 litres. Tom and Charles a lot of trouble with closed circuit and finally away at 7:50. Got great thrill from watching progress. Tom and Charles surged ahead, but John soon stopped and dumped loads about 150 feet above Swiss Ridge Camp. Dump at about 27,350 feet. Tenzing and I reached South Col in 2 3/4 hours. Saw John and Da Nam Gyal descending, and went and met them and assisted them back to camp. John was very exhausted. The other boys duly arrived, but 3 Ridge Sherpas trailed the field by miles. 5 South Col types had gone exceptionally well. Da Tenzing, Da Watonda, second time, Topka, second time, Ang Norbu, second time, Analu, second time. They returned to 7 at 1 p.m. Tom and Charles disappeared over South Summit. What an achievement. At 3:30 p.m., Tom and Charles appeared out of the mist and seemed very tired and exhausted. Tom rather disappointed at not having gone on, but Charles convinced that if they had, they wouldn't have returned. They both painted gloomy pictures of the summit ridge. It was blowing furiously and extremely miserable on the Col. May 27. One of the worst nights I have ever experienced. Very strong wind, very cold, minus 25 degrees centigrade, and very uncomfortable. T and I and George and Greg were in pyramid on oxygen. John, Tom and Charles and Meade, and 3 Sherpas in small dome. A very windy morning indeed, and couldn't get warm. Tom and Charles were completely exhausted. They finally decided to get away. Ang Temba had been sick all night, so he too was to go down. John, after discussion, rather pointed, decided to descend. It was a pathetic sight to see the bunch climb the slope above camp. Tom was on his knees on numerous occasions, and we had to give him an oxygen bottle. John, too, was very tired, and the determined Charles seemed the only rational member of the party. They finally disappeared and had a most difficult descent to 7, where fortunately Mike Ward was in residence and was able to give them help. May 28th to 9. A fine but windy morning, minus 25 degrees centigrade. First blow was that Pemba was sick, leaving us only 1 Sherpa, Ang Nima. We decided we'd have to carry up the camp ourselves. George took 3 LAs on frame, weighing about 41 pounds. Greg had RAF set plus Primus and food, about 40. Ang Nima had 3 LAs, 40 pounds. Tenzing had 2 LAs and all personal, and so did I, at least 49 to 50 pounds. George, Greg and Ang Nima departed at 8:45 and made a lot of height up the Kulwar by the time Tenzing and I left at 10 a.m. Our load slowed us down, but we were going well. The Kulwar was hard wind-blown snow and had to be cut for many hundreds of feet. George was going very well and did most of this cutting. All the Sahibs were on 4 litres and Ang Nima on 2 litres. Tenzing and I caught up to the others on the ridge by the Swiss tent, 200 feet approx. Another 150 feet up, we came to the dump made by John and Da Nam Gyal of tent, fuel and food and oxygen. After discussion, we decided to push on carrying all the gear. I took on the tent, making my load over 60 pounds. George and Greg made theirs up to at least 50, and Ang Nima and Tenzing were over 45 pounds. Continued on up the ridge. George did most of the leading and plugging. Ridge steep, but little snow over rocks with upward sloping strata gave easy going. Continued for some time, but no sign of camping site. Oxygen was running low and we had to switch over onto some of the salt supplies. Position getting a bit desperate when Tenzing did a lead out over deep unstable snow to the left and finally to a somewhat more flattish spot beneath a rock bluff. We decided to camp here at approximately 27,900 feet. Gave others some oxygen and sent them down. It was 2:30 p.m. T and I took off O2 and set to work making campsite, A frightful job. Chopped out frozen rubble with ice axes and tried to level area. By 5 p.m. had cleared a site large enough for tent, but on 2 levels. Decided it would have to do, so pitched tent on it. Had no effective means of tying tent down, so hitched some ropes and O2 bottles sunk in snow and hoped for the best. At 6 p.m, moved into the tent. Tenzing had his lilo along bottom level, overhanging slope. I sat on top level with my feet on bottom and was able to brace the whole tent against the quarter-hourly huge gusts of wind. The Primus worked like a charm, and we consumed large amounts of very sweet lemon water, soup and coffee, and ate with relish sardines on biscuits, a tin of apricots, dates, biscuits on jam. I had made an inventory of our oxygen supplies, necessarily low due to the reduced lift, and found that we only had 1 3/4 LAs, 2,000 litres, left for the assault. By relying on the 2 1/3 full bottles left by Tom and Charles about 500 feet below South Summit, I thought we could make an attack using about 3 litres a minute. I had adjustments for this, and fortunately Tenzing, set on 4 litres, was really only a true 3 litres. We also had a little excess O2 in 3 nearly empty bottles, and this would give us about 4 hours sleeping O2. Although the thermometer registered minus 27 degrees centigrade, it was not unpleasantly cold as the wind was confined to casual strong gusts. I spread the oxygen into 2-hour periods, and although I was sitting up, I dozed reasonably well. Between O2 sessions, we brewed up and had lemon juice and biscuits. It was very noticeable that though we had no O2 from 2:30 until about 9 p.m, that we were only slightly breathless and could work quite hard. May 29th, Summit. At 4 a.m. the weather looked perfect and the view superb. Tenzing pointed out, thing bosher. We commenced making drinks and food and thawing out frozen boots over the Primus. I got the O2 sets into the tent and tested them out. At 6:30 a.m. we moved off and, taking turns, plugged up the ridge above camp. The ridge narrowed considerably, and the breakable crust made plugging tedious and balance difficult. We soon reached the 2 O2 bottles and were greatly relieved to find about 100 pounds pressure in each. The narrow ridge led up to the very impressive steep snow face running to the South Summit. The other boys had ascended the rocks on the left and then descended the snow on return. Their tracks were only faintly visible, and we liked neither route. We discussed the matter, and I decided for the snow. We commenced plugging up in foot-deep steps with a thin wind crust on top and precious little belay for the ice axe. It was altogether most unsatisfactory, and whenever I felt feelings of fear regarding it, I'd say to myself, forget it. This is Everest, and you've got to take a few risks. Tenzing expressed his extreme dislike, but made no suggestions regarding turning back. Taking turns, we made slow speed up this vast slope. After several hundred feet, the angle eased a little, and the slope was broken by more rock outcrops, and the tension eased. At 9 a.m, we cramponed up onto the fine peak at the South Summit. We looked with some eagerness on the ridge ahead, as this was the crux of the climb. Both Tom and Charles had expressed comments on the difficulties of the ridge ahead, and I was not feeling particularly hopeful. The sight ahead was impressive, but not disheartening. On the right, long cornices like fingers hung over the Kangchung. From these cornices, a steep slope ran down to the top of the rocks, which dropped 8,000 feet to the West Coombe. I thought I saw a middle route by cutting steps along the snow above the rocks and sufficiently far down to be out of danger from the cornices. Our first 3/4 bottle was finished, so we discarded them and set off with a light 11-pound apparatus, 1 full bottle and 3 litres a minute. We dropped off the South Summit, and keeping low on the left, I commenced cutting steps in excellent firm frozen snow. It was first-class going, and as I was feeling very well, we made steady progress. Some of the cornice bumps proved tricky, but I was able to turn them by dropping right down onto the rocks and scrambling by. Tenzing had me on a tight rope all the time, and we moved throughout, one at a time. After an hour or so, we came to a vertical rock step in the ridge. This appeared quite a problem. However, the step was bounded on its right by a vertical snow cliff, and I was able to jam myself between the rock and snow. With considerable effort, I was able to work my way up this 40-foot crack and finally got over the top. I was rather surprised and pleased that I was capable of effort at this height. I brought T up with difficulty. I noticed he was proving a little sluggish, but an excellent and safe companion for all that. I really felt now that we were going to get to the top and that nothing could stop us. I kept frequent watch on our oxygen consumption and was encouraged to find it at a steady rate. I continued on cutting steadily, surmounting bump after bump and cornice after cornice, looking eagerly for the summit. It seemed impossible to pick it, and time was running out. Finally, I cut around the back of an extra-large hump and then on a tight rope to its top. Immediately, it was obvious that we had reached our objective. It was 11:30 a.m. We were on top of Everest. To the north, an impressive cornice ridge ran down to the East Rongbuk. We could see nothing of the old northwest route, but were looking down on the North Col and Changxi. The west ridge dropped away in broad sweeps, and we had a great view of the Khumbu and Pomori far below us. Muchalu, Kangchenjunga, and Lhotse were all dominant to the east, looking considerably less impressive than I had ever seen them. I noticed that the Barun approaches to Muchalu looked very difficult, if not impossible, a 1,000-foot rock cliff. Tenzing and I shook hands, and he so far forgot himself as to embrace me. It was quite a moment. We took off our O2, and for 10 minutes I photographed T holding flags, the various ridges of Everest, and the general view. I left a crucifix on top for John Hunt, and T made a little hole in the snow and put in some food offerings, lollies and biscuits and chocolate. We ate a Kendal mint cake and then put back on our O2. I was a little worried by the time factor, so after 15 minutes on top, we turned back at 11:45 a.m. The steps along the ridge made progress relatively easy, and the only problem was the rock step, which demanded another jamming session. At 12:45, we were back on the south summit, both now rather fatigued. Wasting no time, our O2 was getting low, we set off down the great slope, still in considerable trepidation about its safeness. This was quite a mental strain, and as I was coming down first, I repacked every step with great care. Tenzing was a tower of strength, and his very fine ability to keep a tight rope most encouraging. After what seemed a lifetime, the angle eased off and we were soon leading down onto the narrow snow ridge and finally to the dump of O2 bottles. We loaded these on and then, rather tired, wended our way down our tracks and collapsed into our camp at 2 p.m. Our original bottles were now exhausted. They had given us 4 3/4 hours running, and allowing 800 litres in these very full bottles, our consumption rate had been 2 5/6 litres per minute. At the ridge camp, we had a brew of lemon and sugar, and then packed up all our gear and connected up our last bottles 1/3 full. At 3 p.m. we left the ridge camp, and although we were tired, made good time down the ridge to the Swiss camp and the couloir. The snow in the couloir was firm, and we had to recut all the steps. We kicked down the lower portions and then cramp on very wearily down to meet George, who met us with soup just above camp. My comment was, well, we knocked the bastard off. Wilf Noyce and Pasang Puta had come up the same day, and it was good to see their fresh faces. We had a long talk and then to bed on O2.
We reached the south summit of Everest, which is 28,700 feet, and then we looked along the summit ridge, which is quite an impressive narrow ridge. It's corniced on one side, which is overhanging with snow and ice, so you can't keep on the crest of the ridge. We had to keep down on the steep left-hand side on snow and ice. But halfway along the ridge, there's a rock step. It's about 40 feet high. And I cut steps along the side of the ridge until we reached the bottom of the rock step. And looking up at the rock step at 29,000 feet, it really did look extremely difficult to overcome. But then I noticed that out to the right of the rock step, where the ice was plastered onto the wall, There was a crack, I don't know, maybe 2 feet wide, but just large enough to crawl inside, where the ice was breaking away from the rock. And I sort of crawled inside that, and then I wriggled and jammed my way up the crack with rock on one side and ice on the other, and finally pulled myself out onto the top of the rock step. And that was really the first moment during the whole of the expedition that I was confident that we were going to get to the top. But overcoming that rock step, which we knew existed, we'd seen it from far below, made me feel the confidence that we were going to succeed. And sure enough, on we went, and we ultimately reached the top. Funnily enough, that step is now called the Hillary Step. And any climber who climbs Everest from that south side at some stage has to go up the Hillary Step. We reached the...
I really love how he is incredibly happy about how it's now called the Hillary Step. So that sort of is the end to the audio clips. The next part I sort of wanted to show was examples of the views from the top. So sorry if you get a bit of vertigo with these movements of the camera. This one is first looking east from the summit. And I'll go through the anti-clockwise. Showing the view north, and you can see the North Col below and the Shanxi Peak. Then showing the view to the west, and down below, behind the sort of hill, although none of these are hills, the base camp is down below there. And then finally to the south, and you can sort of see where they kind of came from up the south summit from South Col, and then over slightly to the right and below is Camp 7. And then finally a view of encapsulating the entire course from the top, and then a couple of videos to end.
So this is it. This is what they came to see. This is what they came to climb. It is still many miles, many days, many buckets of sweat to the snow world. Nightmare of spikes and chasms, a wrinkled and ravaged face, but a face that is always changing. For the ice is always on the move, cracking, rumbling, roaring. Already they are moving slowly. Altitude tells up here and begins to sap a man's energy. Two very small men cutting steps in the roof of the world.
We're starting to slow down a bit, getting a little tired, and I think we're almost getting a little desperate, now seeking for the summit. Well, I cut round the back of one ridge and round the back of another ridge, and the summit never seemed to be coming any closer. But finally, I cut round the back of another one and saw that the ridge ahead dropped steeply away. So I looked up, and there was a little rounded cone above us, and I knew it was the summit.
All that was needed was a few more blows with the ice axe, and Hillary and Tenzing stood on the summit of Everest.
Auckland sees the end of an epic journey to and from the top of the world, and a crowd of thousands waits to welcome New Zealand's heroes. From aboard the Solent flying boat, Sir Edmund, Hillary and George Lowe emerged to report all's well to the men and women who in spirit were never far behind them. Fellow alpinists and many others struggled for a foothold, and none was prouder of the hero than his nephew John. This was not the civic welcome, but a truly spontaneous greeting by his admirers and friends. All the excuse they needed was they were fellow New Zealanders. As George Lowe spoke his piece, he was watched with pride by Hillary's parents and Sir John Allen, Mayor of Auckland. And did their listeners give them a hand? In his hometown, Papakura, Hillary was greeted not only by the mayor, but by the town's school children who had been given a special half-holiday. Following one more civic reception was reunion with his family, and none more pleased to see him than his brother Rex.
What do you consider were the highlights of your trip to Everest?
Well, I suppose the main highlights were the actual bits on the mountain itself. The icefall, perhaps, was the most interesting thing. We were nervous a good deal of the time, and some of the bits of ice hanging overhead, so it made a rather keen impression on us. And with me especially, I think the last summit effort from the South Pole to the top, naturally I'll remember for some time.
What about that rock step? It was fairly steep, wasn't it?
Yeah, it wasn't too bad. I was a bit worried about it first and thought that we wouldn't get up it. But fortunately there was a crack between the ice and the rock. I got into this and I was able to wriggle my way up it.
And you had to use your spikes and handholds, what you could find, did you?
Yes, I used the spikes on my boots on the ice behind me and just held onto any old handhold I could find on the rock in front.
Yes. And I believe George Lowe did a very fine job.
Yes, George did extremely well. He did a jolly good job on the Lhotse face, which ranges from about 22 to 25,000 feet. And really he was meant to have been washed out on that, but he wouldn't remain done in, and later on he carried the highest camp up to nearly 28,000 feet.
And they put in a phenomenal time on the Lhotse face, didn't they, at that height?
Yes, he was there for nearly 9 days, and
I think that's probably the longest time anybody's ever spent at that height.
Yes. Now, after climbing Everest, what are your impressions of the New Zealand mountains?
Well, I still think the New Zealand mountains are extremely fine ones. In fact, we have wonderful mountains here. They have so much snow and ice on them that they give wonderful training for the Himalayas. Now, weather here is so bad that we have to be extremely careful with our climbing. And just as we on Everest took every care and consideration with the result that we had no casualties at all, I think in the New Zealand Alps you have to use very sound judgment and considerable amount of care in our very difficult conditions.
Alright, well, I guess the end of that video is a very good ending to this one. Thank you very much for remaining through, and I hope you enjoyed it, and I really enjoyed making it. So, thank you to New Zealand Archives for the videos, Radio New Zealand and in association with the Hillary family for putting the diaries up and making them available, and also to Google for giving an opportunity to showcase some of one of New Zealand's most famous events. Cheers, thanks.